Generally speaking, people who raise on the river, well, they just have the best hand. However, a lot of players will attempt the bluff raise on the river. I actually can recall a televised hand with Freddie Deeb that is a good example of a time when I personally made a really big bluff raise. This was a really good structured tournament, so we both had a ton of chips to play, approximately 350,000 before the hand started, and we were playing pretty passively up until that point. So I limped on the button for 1,600 with the ace-7 offsuit. I had the ace of hearts in my hand, and Freddie decided to raise 7,000. Now, I figured that Freddie had a hand, but I had position and I had a hand that I felt was just a little too strong to fold, so I decided to call. Now the flop comes king 6 deuce with 2 hearts. Now, as I said, I had the ace of hearts in my hand, which really doesn't help a ton on this flop since I need runner hearts. Although at the same time, with these stacks, I figured that with the ace of hearts, I may have an opportunity here to represent a flush if it comes, a little pot limit Omaha-like trick. So anyway, Freddie goes ahead and bets 16,000, which is a pretty big bet. And I felt at this point that there was a very good chance that Freddie might have like queens, jacks, tens, or something like that. And he's just taking this one stab with the king out there, and if I call him, I might be able to take the pot later. So I decided to call with the intention of stealing it on the turn if he checks. Well, the turn comes a 4. So now the board is king 6 4 deuce with 2 hearts, and Freddie does check. I go ahead and try to steal it for 30,000, and Freddie smooth calls. So now I'm thinking, well, I'm not really sure what he has, but I'm pretty much committed to going ahead and bluffing on the river with a big bet. The river card comes the 4 of hearts. It pairs the 4, puts a flush out there. I mean, just as an everything card. It's a very significant card, especially also because Freddie knows that I will play hands like 3-5 and 4-5 and stuff like that. So, that's not out of the question. Neither is like 6-4, which would be like a full house, even trip 4s, anything. He knows I can have anything. Put it that way. Okay. Now here's where the hand on the river gets interesting, and where a few mistakes were made that I'd like to call out and explain. At this point, it's Freddie's action first, since I had a position on the hand, and he decides to bet 65,000. Now, with me holding the ace of hearts and looking at the way the hand played, I mean, you can see that Freddie's bet is questionable here. It's not a huge bet. It looks like a value bet, but here's the thing. I have the ace of hearts, right? So I know he doesn't have the nut flush. We likely know another thing. If he didn't raise me back on the turn, well, he probably didn't have 2 pair or trips, because he probably would have had to check raise me. Since he raised before the flop, you would assume that he may have a hand like, ace, king, and is now betting assuming that I might check behind. So he's making, in a sense, like a defensive bet, or that's what it could be. But he's doing it in a situation against a thinking player. That'd be me. A good player. That'd be me. Who is capable of potentially making a play and stealing the pot. I've done it before. So now he makes the 65,000 bet, and it's decision time for me. Okay. At this point, there's a big difference between knowledge and execution. At this point, I feel like a bluff raise on the river is going to work. But the question is, how much? If I go all in, it looks a little bit suspicious, doesn't it? I want him to fold, obviously, and he hasn't shown a lot of strength throughout the hand by check calling the turn. So I'm thinking to myself that I have to make it look like I want him to call. And at the same time, I've also got to protect myself from going broke on the hand. So I call the 65,000 and raise him 100,000 more, thinking that Freddie's a good player and he'll fold ace-king because, really, what can he beat? The only thing he can beat is a complete and utter bluff. I know that Freddie doesn't have a flush because the way we were playing, he probably wouldn't have raised out of the big blind with 2 hearts that didn't contain the ace of hearts. So his most likely hand is an ace-king or maybe even pocket aces, but that's a hand that Freddie knows. If I'm raising, I have to have that beat. So now Freddie thinks for a long time. He looks over at me and he says, "Yeah, you flopped the set, huh?" And he throws away the ace-king, and I'm like, "Yay!" And of course, I stick the needle in and I show him the bluff, but that's beyond the point. Let's look at this hand from Freddie's perspective, okay? You see, in this situation, Freddie should have checked the river. I was pretty committed to following through with my bluff, and I was probably going to make a bet of about 100,000. So now in this case, Freddie's got a decent hand, he's got a bluff-catching hand, and he's got the ace-king, so he can check the river. I'm going to bet my 100,000 now. He can call it or make a decision, but he's probably going to call. But the worst thing that he did was to bet. Not only did he not win the pot, he should have won, but he also lost an additional 65,000 by betting, and he never got to see my hand except for me showing it. Whereas he could have just checked the river and hoped that I either check and he wins the pot, or maybe I'll bet and then he could decide whether or not he thinks I'm bluffing. But either way, he's not committed to that 65,000 with the potential of not even seeing my hand through. Now, Freddie's a great player, and this was an interesting hand played by 2 sophisticated players. I think it shows you a little bit about how sometimes the decisions you make on the river can actually lose the pot for you. Let's take a look at another hand that illustrates my point. Now this hand comes from the 2003 World Series of Poker main event. It's actually a hand I played with Sammy Farha, who, as you remember, went on to finish second that year. It was day 2, and I entered the day with about 21,000 chips, which I wasn't thrilled about, but I was far from out of it. My chips fluctuated maybe between 13 to 30,000 for most of the day. I never really got over the hump, but I felt lucky to recover several times from, dangerously low stacks. So with blinds of 3 and 600 and a 75 ante, I had about 23,000 when this hand came up. I was under the gun with pocket eights, and I came in with a raise to 2,000. Normally I would raise less than that, but with 2 loose aggressive players in the blind, I wanted them to at least think about throwing their hand away. If I made it 1,500 or 1,600, I think I'd get at least one of the 2 blinds to call, close to 90% of the time, considering their stack sizes compared to mine and their propensity to play lots of marginal hands. So, some may suggest that my raise was still too small and that I should have come in for at least 2,400, but that's just not the small ball style at all, now is it? So anyway, everyone folded around to Sammy in the big blind, and of course he didn't disappoint. He calls. The flop comes, Jack, 7, 5, all hearts. Now, this looks like a good flop for me. There's just one overcard to my pair of eights, and I also have a flush draw with the 8 of hearts. Sammy checked. Okay, now, it'd usually be correct to make a decent-sized bet in the situation, but I don't know, my instincts told me that Sammy was getting a little fed up with me, raising him and betting too much. You see, in several previous hands, he'd seen me bet the flop with a weak hand in hopes of stealing it right there. So if I bet here, I thought a check raise was a genuine threat. If I was going to get check raised, now that's going to put me in a really horrible situation, as I'd have to make a really tough decision. So I decided to check and give Sammy a free card. If the turn was another good one for me, well, I would have to reassess my strategy. Well, the turn, king of diamonds. I wouldn't call that a great card, while Sammy could easily be holding a king in his hand. Sammy checked, and I wasn't confident that I had the best hand, but, I was actually confident that I had the best hand, but not so confident that I could fade a check raise in that spot. So I checked again. Now, here's where it gets a little sticky. Either one of us could have the nuts here. I could be trapping Sammy with the nut flush or vice versa. Of course, I know all I have is a pair of eights, so I'm not trapping, but there's no reason to think Sammy couldn't be. The river brings the 8 of spades. That gives me a set. Now, that's an interesting card. It fills the potential 10-9, 6-9, and 6-4 straights. And these are all hands that Sammy would gladly call a $1,400 raise with. There's now about 5,000 in the pot, and Sammy decides to bet 2,000. So I still think I've got him. It looks to me like Sammy's just value betting a pair of kings or a pair of jacks, sort of hoping I'll call but not raise. The cardinal sin I made here is I got a little bit greedy against a pretty good player. And instead of just calling with my 3/8 and taking the pot, I raised him. Now, I raised him a little bit more just to try to get him to pay it off. Now, here's the thing. Sammy's a good player, and he's also a good pot limit Omaha player, which is a game that involves blockers, meaning that if you have a key card like the ace of hearts, you can play hands differently. So now I raise, and Sammy re-raises me, and I'm thinking, what an idiot I am. I'm now in one of the most difficult situations because I know that Sammy's crafty, and I also know that if Sammy only had the ace of hearts, he might actually be able to make a play like this. Or, I don't know, he might have the nut flush. What am I supposed to do here? I'm totally confused. Eventually, the bet was far too big, and I felt like, I couldn't make the call. But this is a situation where if I would have just called the river instead of getting greedy, I get to see Sammy's hand. If he's bluffing, I win the pot. If not, oh well, I lose, but at least I find out. In this case, however, Sammy makes the big raise, I throw the hand away, and of course, before mucking his hand, Sammy decides to show me the ace of hearts. He doesn't show me both cards, but it's irrelevant, really, because the mistake was already made on my part by raising the river. Whether he had the flush or not, he had the key card, and I opened the door for him to bluff me by raising him. I don't even know to this day whether he bluffed me, and for this example, it's really relevant. It's basically a situation where I outplayed myself on the river. And the key concept throughout everything I'm talking about now with river play is that you don't want to play a hand in such a way that you're actually going to have to fold the best hand. You don't want to overplay your hands. You have to sacrifice value sometimes in order to be a little more careful.